I'm Rick Sinding. It's May 13th, 2013. We're here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University as part of the Center on the American Governor. We're conducting a series of interviews as part of the Florio administration archive. And today I'll be interviewing Scott Weiner, who served both as the president of the Board of Public Utilities and later as the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection and Energy in the Florio administration. Scott, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's begin by talking a little bit about your background. Before you got involved with or met Jim Florio, what did you do? Where did you grow up? What's your training and background?
I grew up, I would describe as my Wonder Bread years, really, from about the 8th grade on in Fordley, New Jersey. Had traveled around a little bit, and my father died when I was young. My mother and I and my brother moved back to Forest Hills, but in 1962, I moved to Fordley, and that's really where I put down roots. Went to school there, went on to graduate from New York University as an undergrad, worked for a couple of years in an employment training program in New York City, then went to law school because my grandmother said, go to law school, what can it hurt? And my career is a vindication of that and many other things she said.
After law school?
After law school, I practiced law a little bit. And what really takes me into this segment, I was also a councilman in Fordley, served as council president while I was in law school, and then practiced law.
Pretty young age to be serving as council president.
I was 26 at the time I was appointed. You may recall, I don't know if the viewers this will recall, Bird Ross and his notoriety for having blown the whistle on an attempted bribe scheme. Long story made short, Bird resigns from the council, goes on to become Governor Burns' energy director, headed up the Division of Energy, the first Division of Energy, and a vacancy occurred on the council, and I was appointed. I'd been active in Democratic politics in the state, in our youth movement, if you will.
Had you always been interested in politics?
Probably from high school on. I was involved as an organizer, both in the anti-war movement at Syracuse University and elsewhere. Worked to lower the voting age in New Jersey to 18 many years, and eventually ran for council in Fordley when I was 21. Lost by a couple hundred votes, and then a few years later had an opportunity to be appointed and stayed on for 5 years, eventually becoming the Borough Council president. Went back to law school during that period. And got involved in some campaigns, some state and national campaigns, and in 1981 was appointed the executive director of the Election Law Enforcement Commission.
This is a relatively new agency at that
Relatively new at that time.
It started in the 70s.
It started in the 70s, right after Watergate. It was New Jersey's answer to that. I was the third executive director. David Norcross was the first, and it was followed by Lou Thurston. And then
So Democrat, Republican, now
Lou Thurston,
Democrat.
Yeah, that's right. And it was a viciously bipartisan commission, so they did that. And
viciously bipartisan or nonpartisan?
Well, both bipartisan and nonpartisan. I mean, our work was nonpartisan, but in terms of how people were appointed, it worked hard to be both bipartisan and nonpartisan, so that its members, the commissioners, were people of notoriety, and they were clearly partisan. When they came there, they worked together towards this common goal.
Now, this common goal was to set up a reporting mechanism for people who are running for state office to report the sources and the nature of the campaign contributions that they receive?
That's right. In fact, not only state office, but every office in New Jersey, local municipal office, school boards, local fire districts, anybody who ran for public office had to file a disclosure report listing who they were raising their money from and what they were spending it on.
Oh, also what they were spending it on?
Yeah.
So this must be some voluminous document keeping.
It was. We had a public library, and this was a time when access to that information was new. New Jersey really was at a forefront in doing this. And we also were the first lobbying disclosure program in the state, and one of the first in the country.
So lobbyists also had to file annual reports?
Lobbyists did, and the employers of lobbyists had to indicate who they were. So there was annual reporting going on.
And my recollection is that in 1977, which was the first gubernatorial election in which there was public financing, it extended only to the general election, and both Brendan Byrne and Ray Bateman participated in that program. But there was an excessive amount of spending in the primaries, and a subsequent law extended the law enforcement to the primaries as well.
Public finance to the primaries, and back in the late 70s, even to the early 80s, public disclosure campaign finance regulation was still considered a virtuous policy initiative. So I was appointed in the summer of 1981, which was a gubernatorial election year, as you know.
As the chair, or as
the executive director?
As the executive director.
As the executive director. We had 2 Democratic commissioners and 2 Republican commissioners. And it was the election cycle, it was right after the primary, so I had to administer the public financing program for the 1981 gubernatorial election between then candidate Jim Florio and Tom Kane.
So is that when you first met
Jim
Florio?
That's when I first met Jim Florio.
But this would be entirely as a regulator and a regulatee.
That's right. I met him, and I met his senior staff, if you will.
Who was running that camp? Who were the money people of that camp?
Well, I really got to know the regulatory people, the people who were charged. I said to you before we started, this is an interesting exercise going back 20 some odd years into my brain.
Or in this case, 30 or more.
That's right. But some names that may come up during this series, Angelo Genova was a young lawyer, as we were all young people at that time. He was working on that campaign. Alan Nickerson was another one of the lawyers. Nick Rudy, a name well known to many people in New Jersey, was the campaign treasurer. And in fact, an interesting story was I had worked on the campaign of one of candidate Florio's opponents, Bob Rowe. And a colleague from New Jersey was one of the commissioners.
Was this in 81? Or
this was in 81. This was in 81. So long story made short, I end up being proposed for this position. I compete for it. I get selected. And the weekend before I'm supposed to start, there's a little piece in the New York Times that said Lou Thurston is going back to the Senate staff to help run Tom Kane's campaign, and some guy named Scott Weiner from Bergen County is being appointed. So I report for my first day at work, and before the end of the first day of work, I get a call from my new secretary who says that the chief of staff, the governor's chief of staff, Harold Hodes, was on the phone.
This is Brendan Byrne's chief of staff.
And but he left a message, and I said, "Oh, really? What was the message?" "Well, today's your last day." And this was because the governor's office felt that they hadn't gotten notice that I was being appointed. Anybody was being appointed.
Who appointed you?
The commission, which was in this case violently independent and statutorily independent.
So the 4 members of the commission independently chose you as the executive
and they have
director.
they have the independence to do that. So it was an interesting little side story, but it was in that campaign that I got to know, first introduced to Jim Florio and members of his team, who I'd end up working closely with some 8 years later.
How did you survive Harold Hodes's announcement to you that this was your last day?
Oh, it was fine. The way it all worked out is some people interceded, pointed out that as much as people in the front office might like to control everything, there's certain things they can't. An appropriate face saving was found for everybody, and I went on to have, I think, was a good tour of duty at the commission.
And how long did that tour of duty last?
That was about 3 years, till 1984, when I spent a year as Frank Lautenberg State Director.
Ah, okay. Lautenberg was elected in
the year before.
82?
82, 83 was his first full year, and in 84, I was asked to come on and help organize the New Jersey office.
So you worked in the Newark office?
I worked in Newark, traveled to Washington a little bit, but got a chance to work with Senator Lautenberg very closely.
So at this point, you're fairly deeply ensconced in politics, now in Democratic politics. What did you do then?
I went back to practice law. I'd spent my year with the senator, went back to practice law, and also considered running for county executive in Bergen County. in 1986, which was a new charter election. It was the first time Bergen County was gonna have a
Bergen did not have a county executive
Not at that
before
point.
that. Okay, so they were shifting over to
That's
the
right.
county executive form of government.
So I threw my hat in the ring, and along with a group of other active Democrats at the time, we ended up in a death match, which was then settled by former state Senator Matty Feldman throwing his hat in the ring. You may recall, you may not recall, that Matty ended up running for county executive of the Democratic Party. Steve Rothman, now Congressman, former Congressman Rothman, was one of my opponents. We all eventually stepped aside for the Senator Feldman, and I was then asked to run his campaign. So I ran that 1986 campaign unsuccessfully.
Yeah, who won that election?
Now you
Yeah,
embarrass me.
I'm trying to remember too.
So I apologize for not remembering your name.
Okay. All right, so you ran Matty Feldman's campaign for, now he continued on in the state Senate.
He continued on in the state Senate. I went back to work as a lawyer and continued to practice law. And in fact, by 1988, on a personal level, I was now actively engaged in the practice of law in Newark. I had not gotten involved in any campaigns.
This is with a firm?
It was with a firm, and said, man, I'm cured. I think I'm cured of this bug. And I remember taking my family away during the summer for our first 2-week vacation. And around the time I got back, I got a call from then soon-to-be candidate Florio and some of his staff asking if I could meet. And the purpose of that meeting was to talk about his candidacy, my experience at the Election Law Enforcement Commission, and for some years after that, I continued to consult on campaign finance issues. And that eventually led to an invitation to join a small group of lawyers to help organize the campaign, the legal aspect of the campaign.
So this is in mid to late 1988?
This is in, mid-late, post-summer 88.
In anticipation of the 89 gubernatorial election.
Okay. So I was part of a lawyers committee that did all sorts of legal things to get a campaign started.
And Angelo Genova and...
Steve Edelstein, Ron Bookbinder, and Don Scarinci and I were the team.
Okay.
And we put that together, and then that led shortly afterwards to an invitation by the governor to serve as his treasurer for the campaign. And that, particularly in a publicly financed campaign, rather than being a fundraising position, was much more of a compliance position, a budgeting position.
So making sure that the Election Law Enforcement Commission reports were all filed properly, that the...
budget was not overspended, and the like.
Okay. All right, so you're the treasurer in the campaign. Now, does the treasurer get involved in any way in policy decisions, in deciding campaign strategy, or are you strictly a money man?
Very little on strategy and politics, but some. I mean, there was a group of us that were there full time, did this every day, and we all.
Oh, you're now on the campaign. You're a paid member of the campaign
spending
staff.
80% of my time there, and so I got involved in it. But we each had our areas of responsibility, whether it be communications or policy or fundraising or compliance. Politics and the like, and we all collaborated. It really was a very effective organization.
So, 89 campaign, how close at this point did you feel to Jim Florio? How do you feel as though you had really gotten to know him at this point? Or was there some distance between the candidate and the people who were working on the campaign?
No, for those of us, and even some people who weren't full-time, but were very active in the campaign, there was a lot of intimacy with him as a candidate, but also as a human being. For me, that process was accelerated in part because I ended up being his driver for a while. And early on in the campaign, I would either volunteer or be assigned to drive from one place to another, and there's no better way to get to know somebody than to be in the car all day with them.
I think probably one of the great, I don't know if it's an untold story or one of the things that people who are close to politics in New Jersey know is that many, many cabinet officers have gotten their start working as the driver for the candidate. I can think of a couple of folks who did that for Tom Kaine.
That's right.
And I guess it continues to this day.
It's my continuing advice saying, but if you have the opportunity, be the driver.
All right, so you drove him around, you filed...
Pat Schubert.
Oh, The first
That's right.
the Republican county executive
That's
in
correct.
Bergen County. I knew it would come to you
Yeah.
eventually. It would not have come to me. All right, so the '89 campaign works along. You drive him around. You are part of the team. Sometime in the mid to late summer, early fall, it becomes fairly obvious that he is going to be elected. At this point, did you have any conversations either with the governor or with Doug Berman, who was running the campaign, or anyone else about what role you might play if Jim Florio were elected governor?
Now, there was no conversations like that until after the election. And it wasn't until very close to the election that there was even the separation of a small group of people who began to work on the eventuality of a win.
That was with Steve Persky coming on
That's
and
absolutely
sort of
correct.
heading up
Yeah.
that transition staff.
That's right. So while Steve and really a second staff with some connection to the senior campaign staff were busy doing that, the rest of us were busy following the candidates' orders to not let up and to make sure that we had a strong finish. So we continued to campaign.
And the election comes out in
Right.
Florio's favor. At this point, are you interested in a appointed position? I mean, how does one? You're in a unique position here. You've been brought on because of your particular expertise in a subject area. You've gotten close to the governor-elect. You're probably interested in possibly going to work in his administration. But how do you play that? I mean, do you want to do you let people know that you are interested? Do you sit back and wait to be asked? How do you go about that?
In thinking about it, it's a very organic process. Timing is everything. So, of course, there's no outward discussion about anything until after the election. And then for people like myself, and there are many of us, the question we faced was, do I want to go inside the administration, stop doing whatever one's doing professionally, and devote so many years to becoming part of an administration, or do you want to stay outside, continue your career and be an advisor, a counsel, or whatever the case may be? I decided that given my background in government and public affairs, that this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so why not take advantage of it and have a chance to really contribute from the inside.
So you let it be known that you would be interested
There was
in
both.
continuing
I mean, I don't know that it's really hard to point out, the moment that the process starts. But one both lets it be known, but you're also being asked about what would you want to do next. Do you want to come inside? Should we be considering you for something? And it just becomes a process that has its own roots. Now, as you know, over the next 4 years, I got very involved in the appointment process on behalf of the administration. And I can say that my experience both coming in and while I was in was the harder one lobbies, the less likely it is you get the result you're looking for.
And I guess you knew that going in. You
Yes.
had already ascertained
That's
that.
absolutely.
And so you have some discussions with the governor-elect directly, or with
Both, with the
senior
governor-elect, with the senior staff, with Steve Persky, who was busy trying to put recommendations together. And there is sort of a convergence of different lines that leads me to the BPU.
the Board of Public Utilities.
Board of Public Utilities. For a number of different reasons, I'd like to think, although after 25 years it may become clouded. One was my practice as a lawyer was in the area of energy, and particularly the financing of solid waste facilities, which at that point was a very big issue in New Jersey. So I had a particular knowledge and expertise in a subject matter that was very important to New Jersey, but also the BPU, since it regulated and approved the financing of these kind of facilities.
That's interesting. I thought I knew your whole background, but obviously I don't. That was at a time when the previous administration, the Kane administration, had been working toward a policy of siting a solid waste facility in each of the 21
that's
counties.
Right. And as a lawyer, particularly with a law firm that specialized in municipal financings and bond law, we were representing either the issuers of these bonds to finance these facilities, or the agencies that would be building the facilities. So it just gave me a particular background in the subject matter. I'd also like to think that my work in New Jersey, particularly in the public arena, helped give me a reputation for being a good manager. And somebody who was good at public policy and somebody who could work with a whole array of constituencies. So long story made short, that led to a offer. That's always a very funny word when it's made, because these are offers that you don't refuse. We'll discuss later, but for me it was an opportunity to do exactly what I wanted to do, and that was be able to head up an agency that was dealing with very important issues for the state.
And those were primarily utility regulation and energy policy.
Yeah, that's correct. The Board of Public Utilities, as its name implies, is the agency that sets rates for regulated utilities. And in the 80s, that included, in the early 90s, the regulation of solid waste. If you go back decades before, streetcars and buses and other things were regulated by the BPU.
And electricity?
And electricity, natural gas, cable television, telephone, which was then going through a major deregulation. And from about the mid-late 70s on, and the energy policy portfolio of New Jersey, I used to describe it as a lost tribe of policy, because it wandered all over the state government. But at that point in time, it was situated at the Board of Public Utilities.
Now, the board was at that time made up of 3 gubernatorial appointees.
Correct.
Was it always 2 members of the majority party and 1 of the minority?
That's right.
So were you nominated as the chair of the board?
Yeah, the way it worked then, there were, as you point out, there were 3 commissioners. By statute, only 2 could be, you could have more than 2 of one party. And the governor had the prerogative of both appointing, subject to confirmation, the commissioners, but could also designate a chair or president, which is the title that they had. So at that point in time, immediately before the election, then Commissioner Whitman served as president of the Board of Public Utilities.
This is Christine Todd Whitman.
That's right.
And she had been an appointee of Tom Kane's, and she was the chair of
the board
of the Board of Public Utilities.
And
I should also point out that Brendan Byrne, years earlier, had served on the Board of Public Utilities.
That's right.
So evidently, it's also a stepping stone to the governorship.
That's
well, for those 2 at least.
Yeah. And then there was a vacancy. I was ultimately appointed that vacancy and designated the chair. And by virtue of being designated the chair of the president, I was also had cabinet status.
And did Christy Whitman continue on?
She continued on until she left the Board of Public Utilities about 3 or 4 months after our inauguration, when we came in January to run against Bill Bradley for the United States Senate.
I realize that this is part of the Florio archive, but I should take advantage of this opportunity maybe to get in a little piece possibly for the Whitman archive. How did your relationship develop with your fellow commissioner? How did you find her to work with?
Well, I want to say that right after my appointment, I got a call from her congratulating me, offering any...
Had you known her before?
I think we had known each other a little bit, maybe because of my work before the board as a lawyer, but I don't think we really knew each other well, if at all. And she was very gracious, very accessible, very helpful during the ensuing weeks of preparing me to take on that job. And then during the months that we served together on the board, she was very easy to work with. We didn't always agree on things. We had different policy perspectives, but she was very collegial. And when we get to the end of the Florio administration, the story comes full circle.
When we get to that, I'll be interested in finding out your reaction and your relationships or dealings with her thereafter. All right, well, let's get back to I guess, late 1989, early 1990. You are nominated.
Right.
This is subject to
Senate confirmation.
So you had a hearing.
I did.
And how did that go?
I guess it went well. I have no recollection of it, but I guess it went well.
There were no, you don't recall any particularly difficult questions being asked or any
No.
opposition arising?
No, I mean, at that point in time, this is now early 1990, and sometime the year before, probably during the campaign year, there had been a number of articles written in the media about the manner in which the BPU functioned or didn't function. It was being viewed then as a black box agency. It's regulated the electric and other utility rates that was equal in size to the state budget at the time, but it was very much a black box.
Just explain what you mean by black box.
But there wasn't a lot of transparency. There were 3 commissioners. Very important issues like rate case and other things would come before them. They couldn't deliberate in private because that would violate the Open Public Meetings Act. But the public meetings were really just opportunities for the public to come in and hear the commissioners say yes or no to certain items. There really wasn't a lot of open dialogue. There had been a couple of major rate cases that always bring public scrutiny. One of the commissioners was the subject of scrutiny because of a testimony event that was provided for him and the manner in which the money was raised from the regulated utilities to underwrite the event. So the BPU had had a lot of notoriety at the time, but people really didn't understand what it was doing.
So did you consider it part of your portfolio, or were you specifically directed to open up the activities of the BPU?
Both. Governor Florio was very concerned about public access to government. So it was just inherent of what we were going to do there to help make the process more transparent and more meaningful. And that was part of the charge. And while we were doing that, we were wrestling with some very major issues. We were at the latter stages of the deregulation of the telephone industry in the country. Cable TV was a major issue in New Jersey at the time, the setting of the rates and its regulation. The deregulation of natural gas was just beginning, and electricity was on the horizon. Then we had this whole issue in New Jersey known as solid waste and how to manage and pay for solid waste disposal in the state.
We should talk a little bit about defining the term of solid waste disposal and solid waste management, because I think it makes a lot of people's eyes glaze over, but what we're really talking about is what happens in terms of the collection and disposal of garbage.
Right.
And this is an area which has been perhaps immortalized by television shows like The Sopranos as an area that's rife with organized crime, has come under a very heavy dose of regulation, and both in terms of making sure that it's being done by reputable organizations and that it's being done efficiently and effectively in terms of both the pickup and the disposal. There's a cradle-to-grave regulation of what happens to household garbage in New Jersey.
And as you pointed out, there was existing law in New Jersey that said every county had to develop its own solid waste management plan. And somewhat oversimplifying it, the 21 counties developed it for a whole host of reasons. Most, if not all, decided they were going to incinerate it, which raised all sorts of environmental issues. It also raised enormous...
These were referred to as resource recovery plants,
That's
not
right.
as municipal solid waste incinerators.
And electricity generators.
Right.
That they would generate electricity.
Well, it should be pointed out that there are countries in Europe that generate a tremendous amount of their energy from burning of garbage.
Well, as do we in New Jersey still. I mean, Essex County has a facility, Union County has a facility, and there are a few others. But the issue came up for the Board of Public Utilities because each of these facilities had to be paid for. They'd be paid for by rates. So you'd build a multi-$100 million facility that would be paid for by everybody who paid for the disposal of garbage. The financing of those facilities would be approved by the Board of Public Utilities. The rates that would be established to pay for that would be done by the Board of Public Utilities. And by 1990, when we were coming to office, there was pushback from both the environmental community, who said the last thing we need is an incinerator in every county, as well as people concerned about the economics of it, as well as a national movement, because part of the way New Jersey managed its solid waste was by saying, we're going to take some of our waste and we're going to take the ashes that's in the incinerator and we're going to send it out to other states for ultimate disposal. So this was a rolling issue that we were dealing with. And as you'll recall, one of the first acts that Governor Florio did was impose a moratorium on the construction of new facilities. And myself as the president of the board and the then commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, Judy Askin, were appointed to co-chair a task force to develop a plan for the management of these facilities.
Which, as I recall, basically involved regionalizing as many of these facilities as possible.
That was the ultimate solution. I think so. From a articulated public policy, there was a moratorium, and then some were abandoned. We said we wouldn't support the financing of it. We regionalized it, but it was also very important for, I think, our administration and also for my work inside the administration that we brought together a very diverse group of people representing all sides of this issue and worked through a sometimes very difficult process of how do you develop a solid waste management plan that can work while still advancing economic rationality and environmental stewardship.
My recollection is, and if we had enough time, we could probably spend the next hour and a half talking about how the Essex County facility was financed, right, and how the whole program was put together involving the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Essex County, several other counties, the state government, bondholders.
That's for somebody else's graduate class.
It was extraordinarily complicated, as I recall. You were in Newark at the Board of Public Utilities. The administration is in Trenton. And without going into all the details of what was going on in the first 6 months of the administration, the Florio administration went from being perceived as a dynamic, policy-oriented group that was reforming automobile insurance and banning assault weapons and appointing an environmental prosecutor and then raising taxes and reforming education spending to a beleaguered, under siege administration by the summer of 1990. You're up in Newark. Mm-hmm. How much of all of that influenced or affected what you were doing at the Board of Public Utilities?
It's interesting. The questions have quite been asked that way. Let me say that the combination of geographic separation, although it's not that great, but it is significant, coupled with some very esoteric issues, which by definition, the reason a utility commission exists is so that supposed experts will deal with these issues outside of the give and take, so the rates are set not on a political basis, but in a quasi-judicial evaluation, really insulated our work from a lot of the tumult that was taking place some 50 or 60 miles to the south. And also the focus, both by my colleagues in the administration, but New Jersey in general, really gave us an opportunity to operate and do the things we needed to do. So in addition to wrestling with the solid waste issues we talked about, we were dealing with some very important energy conservation issues, the beginning of non-utility generation in the state, cable television issues, and making sure that telephone deregulation did not leave the weakest and poorest of our residents without basic telephone service. So we did all that, and in the process tried to make the whole decision-making process of the Board of Public Utilities much more transparent. So we began to deliberate in public. We began to ask the Deputy Attorney Generals or the regulatory officers, attorneys who worked for the agency, rather than just coming up and calling an agenda item and calling for a vote, we asked them to present the matter that was coming before us and to give a history of it and articulate their recommendation on it. And then I'd have some fun because I would invite the other staff members to comment on the presentation. So that we really tried to give an opportunity for the public to be able to see what went into making the decisions we were making.
There was at this point still in the Department of the Public Advocate a ratepayer advocate.
That's right.
And that was that person or that agency actively involved
Yes,
in working with these issues?
Yeah, and very much so, very much so. And they were the institutional foil, who not a foil for us, but for the applicant, for the utility. And we worked very closely together, sometimes siding on issues, sometimes not.
There were a number of cabinet officers who, for I would say certainly the first 6 months to 9 months of the Florio administration, bristled at the notion, and I don't think this is unique to the Florio administration, that they didn't feel as though they really had very much in the way of autonomy or independence, that everything had to be cleared through the front office. And yet the issues they were dealing with didn't necessarily rise to the level of getting an answer out of the front office, and so there was this sort of stalemate or never land that a lot of the cabinet officers felt they were in. Did you ever feel that you were in that position, or again, because of your physical removal and the nature of the issues that you were dealing with, did you always feel as though you had the autonomy and independence that you needed?
I never felt that I didn't have it. The conduct of my job was never affected by it. First of all, what we do very often is meant to be insulated. The setting of rates, as I mentioned, is something where a governor in New Jersey or in any regulatory scheme like this would not get involved and say, here's the answer. We're performing a quasi-judicial function. I knew the administration. I also wanted to make sure that we were all moving in the same direction, whatever metaphor one wants to use. So I would check in, find out what the policy position was. And I think every administration in any state starts out with a very tight control from the governor's office, thinking that you can micromanage everything. And it takes some time, but after a period of weeks or months, that begins to loosen up, both as the cabinet officer begins to really understand the policy trajectory of that governor and the administration, and as a comfort level begins to develop between the governor's senior staff and the cabinet officer. So a lot of it is very personal also. I mean, first of all, Governor Florio as a governor made sure you understood what the important policy issues were for him and the administration, and he expected that you would reflect that in your actions.
Had you and he had serious, in-depth conversations about either utility regulation or energy policy prior to your taking the position?
No, but after the position. I mean, we probably talked about it anecdotally because a lot of it was in the news. But after I was appointed to the position, we did on some of the issues. Utility regulation, not so much, because, again, one of the things the governor got to do was say, well, that's Weiner's fault. Blame him for your rates. But I knew the values that were important for him, the issues of transparency, of openness, of accessibility. Energy policy itself, though, was something different. That's something we did spend a good deal of time talking about. And one of our major initiatives that first year was something which has the arcane name of the standard offer. But it came from a policy position where we said to the utilities, rather than always looking to build generation, electric utilities, as the first source of new capacity, the generation of new, why not pay for conservation and buy conservation the same way you buy electrons from a new generating facility? And that led to one of the first policies in the country where New Jersey utilities would go to energy service companies and say, we will buy conservation from you, which is called negawatts capacity, rather than building a new power plant or going to that independent power plant.
So this comes in the form of credits? Is that how
it works?
I
mean, it's really saying that, we'll oversimplify, I have a factory, and I'm going to reduce my energy conservation because I'm going to make certain investments. And I go to the utility, I'm oversimplifying it, and say, I will sell you conservation. Rather than using 100 kilowatts during this time period, I'm only going to use 80. So you don't have to produce as much electricity, and you can use that capacity you have for some other reason. And rather than going out and buying 20 new units, pay me. Because a kilowatt not consumed is as valuable as a kilowatt of new generation.
I see.
So that was something that we worked on very closely together, and it really was a groundbreaking policy in 1990 in the country.
Were there any other significant environmental, or I'm sorry, utility issues or energy issues that you initiated or were involved in before the move that you've already mentioned came for you from the Board of Public Utilities to the Department of Environmental Protection?
Well, there were a number of them. So we had solid waste issues, we had the electricity issues, as I mentioned, we had telephone deregulation issues. Cable television was a very big issue at the time, the rates over them, what would be included or not included for rates. I recall a very contentious hearing that we conducted on some complaints about the rate setting in a particular community. What we did that was different was there was an expectation that senior government officials would be actively involved in decision making. So in prior administrations, if there was a complaint or something, a middle level bureaucrat would be sent to listen to the testimony that would be presented by various sides. I chaired that hearing. I invite other commissioners to participate in those hearings. I chaired a rate hearing. Because if I had to ultimately make the decision, I also wanted to be involved directly. So it was a busy year, it was an active year, and it was a year of being able to get oriented to what we saw as some major issues coming down the road, including some recent amendments that Congress had passed to the Clean Air Act, and the implication of those amendments to the generation of electricity, to manufacturing activities, and generally cleaning up the air.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. I mean, the issue, several of the issues that you've mentioned now, solid waste management clearly being a major one. Now, Clean Air Act, some things having to do with electric generation, conservation, and so forth, really blend over into the environmental area. Is this the reason that when the governor was looking around for a new environmental commissioner in early 1991, that he tapped you? Did you go to him and say, I'd really be interested in having the environmental portfolio, or
No,
how did this come about?
It was just the opposite. I'll leave it to him to answer the question about why he might have picked me or eventually tapped me. But I wanted to stay at the BPU. For me personally, it was a great agency, it had great issues, and it was something that I wanted to be able to continue to invest time and energy and really develop a policy trajectory. Around the end of the first year, I was asked by the governor to become the DEP commissioner. Although I would have liked to have stayed at the BPU, you don't say no to a governor. And it was a great honor because of how important this issue was for the state, but also given his background. It was very high in his own personal interest level. In discussing that and the implication of all those issues you're talking about, we came up with the idea of why not bring those two policy portfolios together under a common commissioner, so that the reconciliation of what we viewed as competing environmental issues with clean air issues in particular, because that was the flavor of the time, but energy, electricity, environmental issues, all the things embedded in energy issues and environmental issues were going to be brought together for reconciliation at the departmental level, with then recommendations going up to the governor. Now there's a history, I'll try and do it quickly, about the Energy Division, which is, it was always this lost tribe. It was always generally appended somewhere. And there was a period of time when it started at the BPU, it moved to the Commerce Department. There was a period of time when it had its own department during the oil crisis of the 70s. Then it became a division, and in the late 80s, it was appended to the Board of Public Utilities and literally put in a different building down the road. And there was viewed as there was real energy regulation, which was the BPU did, and then there was all this other soft stuff. And all the other soft stuff were issues like energy conservation, renewable energy, all the things that are so embedded into our community fabric today. So during my year at the BPU, we worked very hard to integrate that in and say, how can you develop a policy on electricity, for example, without considering renewables? How can you develop a policy on clean air issues without considering the energy implications of them? So, long story made short again, we discussed it, and the governor endorsed a concept to bring the two under one roof, and we created the Department of Environmental Protection and Energy.
This will be a good time for me to do some full disclosure.
Oh, sure.
The first of these being that in 1974, I worked with the then emergency New Jersey State Energy Office in creating the very first energy master plan for Brendan Byrne, in which the number one recommendation was that energy should have its own departmental portfolio. Brendan Byrne reviewed that and sent the energy portfolio to the Board of Public Utilities. Right. I'm out of government for a while. I come back into government in the Florio administration. I worked in the governor's office for the first year, and one of my areas of involvement was the Board of Public Utilities, and you and I worked together there. And now you're going to the DEP, soon to be the DEPE, and you invited me to come and become first the Director of Policy and Planning and then an Assistant Commissioner, and I worked for you for the next 2 years, 2.5 years, something like that. So I think that needs to be stated at the outset of all this. So anyway, here we have the Energy Agency, which the very first task force had said, make it independent because energy policy is too important to be subservient to utility regulation, to commerce, to environmental, whatever. But you have convinced Jim Florio that there's, and I know I'm going to use your favorite word, a synergy between environmental and energy policy, and so you're going to put together the DEPE. But before that happened, as I recall, you set about a major restructuring of the Department of Environmental Protection, even before the energy portfolio was brought over.
They were happening simultaneously. I was able to work on the restructuring in my executive administrative capacity as the commissioner. The bringing over energy required legislation, so they were sort of happening simultaneously, but we did restructure.
Tell me why, or tell us why, restructuring the agency was the immediate priority upon your assuming the DEP commissionership.
I had a view, which was shared by the governor and others, that at the root of the problem, a root of a problem that was being suffered by both the DEP and people who interact with the DEP was a dysfunctional management and administration. That contrary to sort of urban myth, the department was in fact made up of very competent professional people who were working very hard at what they understood their mission to be. But the agency had grown over the years in a way that it became a bunch of very typical, isolated stovepipe operations that didn't talk to each other, that didn't function together. So you had multiple areas of responsibility for environmental permitting. You had multiple areas of responsibility for enforcement. Each program had its own enforcement group. So we wanted to do something as simple as saying, let's think about this functionally. And we created a group, as you recall, headed up by an assistant commissioner that did environmental regulation. Every aspect of environmental regulation, whether it was air issues or water issues or other land use issues. We had a unified enforcement group. We created a policy office. We did things to try and organize it functionally. And we also tried to make that whole process more transparent. And I tell a story yet today of when I remember, and you may remember it. I had been at the agency for maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and I was sitting in my office, and I saw an attorney who I knew from my prior life wandering around the 7th floor where the commissioner's office was. And I said, "What brings you here?" And this person said, "Well, I'm working on a closing, and I need a permit for that. And we won't get our financing without it." And in an abundance of caution, I've worked with the permit writers, and we've negotiated a very effective permit. And my closing is 2 days from now, and in another abundance of caution, exercise of caution, I called up to find out that the permit was completely rewritten 180 degrees different than what I had discussed. And I'm here to find out why. So I said with the bravado of a young new commissioner, gee, isn't that interesting? I want to find out too. So we convened a meeting at the spot and went to meet with the staff who were responsible for this, including the assistant commissioner who was leaving shortly. And what we found out was that, in fact, there was a permit writer who had negotiated all this, and that permit writer went on vacation. And that permit writer turned to one of their colleagues and said, can you please pick this up and finish this for me? And they said, sure. And in reviewing it, the second permit writer decided they didn't like what the first permit writer was doing. So they completely rewrote the permit. Now, the normal reaction would have said there was an act of arrogance and it was inappropriate for the second permit writer to do that. What we discovered, though, was the department, for the most part, had no existing policies. There were no standards that say, how do you address a certain situation? And although there were regulations, those always don't give you the detail that one needs. So every individual in the department, in the absence of management meaning its responsibility to create standards and policies and to review those and educate people about them, were their own independent DEPs. They'd make their own decisions, and off they'd go. So we tried to work on that issue. Another one that I know you experienced firsthand.
How did that one get resolved, by the way, if you recall?
I do. We got the original permit in. We got a group of people, so it wasn't just picking on one person. Take a look at the original permit and see if, in fact, there was anything wrong with the way it was originally written. The answer was no, and it got reinstated. But the second permit writer wasn't operating out of an arrogance. It was operating really out of a fear. And they said, now this has become my responsibility. I'm supposed to protect the environment. I have nothing to turn to that's going to give me the depth to turn to. And if I do nothing, I know I'm not hurting the environment because I'm not allowing this new work to take place.
This suggests, and I'll let you get on with the other story shortly, this suggests that there was, and there is obviously a popular belief that there still is, an attitude in the DEP that when there is a question of whether the answer should be yes or no, they always come down on the side of no. Is that a fair description?
I think it's an oversimplification, but I would describe it a different way, at least in the early part of our tenure, which is in the absence of clear guidance, the answer always was to do nothing. Or to default to the most stringent environmentally protective action, because after all, isn't that what they were hired to do? So we began a process inside the department to provide leadership through the assistant commissioners and their directors and begin to articulate policies. And we took each one of these as an opportunity to articulate a policy. And it's related to another experience I had shortly after I got there, where one day I'm sitting in my office and in comes somebody with this giant stack of folders. And I say, what is this? And they say, well, these are the decisions you need to sign. And I said, well, that's interesting. Is anybody going to tell me about them? And they said, well, all you have to do is sign where your name is. It's all been reviewed. And you know that we then started a process where once a week, anything that was going to be going out to the public, whether it was an important rule decision, enforcement decision, proposing a rule, adopting a rule, was the subject of a senior staff discussion that included anybody who was involved in the particular issue. And taking a leaf of our experience at the BPU, people would get up, present their position, and I would have the benefit of, as a commissioner, of real-time discussions by my senior middle-level staff about whether or not we should be doing this, all, of course, in conjunction with the governor's office. Mm-hmm. And this is what allowed us, I think, to make great headway in some areas. Going back to the DEPE, as I mentioned, this was a time when recent amendments to the Clean Air Act were dealing with issues of manufacturing capacity. They were dealing with issues of clean fuels and the like. There was the beginning of what was used to be called the California car and the California fuel, as you recall. And now, before any issue got to the governor, it wasn't a member of the governor's staff who had to reconcile all this. Eventually, they would hear it before your counterpart, who would still be in the governor's office. But now we all had to reconcile this inside the department and take all those competing interests and develop a policy recommendation for the governor. And although many other people would vet it before he would finally make his decision, he had the benefit of having this integrated view. So we held a conference during this period. We invited in the directors of the Division of Air from the entire Northeast region and their environmental counterparts from the Northeast region. And much to our surprise and disappointment, in many cases, they had never talked to each other. They worked in different departments, they worked in different buildings, they both were trying to deal with clean air issues, but they just didn't work out. We didn't have that issue in New Jersey, which really allowed us, as the first state to combine those two portfolios, to really be a leader nationally on implementation of the Federal Clean Air Act.
Did Jim Florio give you marching orders when you went to the DEP, clean up that agency, make sure that that agency is not an embarrassment to me, or something to that effect?
You know, I don't know, but I don't know that he would have had to say it because it was an issue. I mean, but environmental issues were very important to him, and we would talk regularly at a very high policy level of what he wanted to accomplish. This idea of transparency, public access to information was all very important to him, and all of us in the cabinet knew that. There were also some environmental issues, but there was never a case of anybody coming down from the governor's office, the governor or anybody else, and giving us a direction of how we had to pre-decide something. Our recommendations weren't always followed, but nobody ever said, don't recommend something.
Can you give us an example of recommendations that you made to the governor's office that weren't followed?
No. Only because I can't remember. The synapses may open in the next hour or so, but I'm sure they were there. There were give and takes all the time. But there was also, with Governor Florio, a real respect for the function and role of a department and the cabinet. So, for example, for years, the DEP had been fighting with a major industrial company in New Jersey over the cleanup of a particular site that company had bought from another company, but under our laws, they were the responsible party. And the chairman and CEO of that company wanted to meet with Governor Florio. And the governor said, you don't see me, go see Commissioner Weiner. And that provided us with the credibility to solve problems. But I think it also put the responsibility in the right place. Now, if that person wasn't satisfied, they would still be able to get a hearing from somebody from the governor's office who might think that things might be done differently. But in this particular case, we never got that far because we were able to work on things together.
Jim Florio got a reputation in Congress because of his authorship of the Superfund law, because of his involvement in the Pine Barrens federal legislation and so forth, of having some considerable personal expertise in the environmental area. Was this in any way intimidating to you when you came in to take on the environmental portfolio, working for a governor who had his own very strong environmental credentials?
No, it wasn't intimidating at all. I mean, it was part of being very honored and humbled. It also meant I had to be on my game, but that's what that was my responsibility. But more than anything, as I think about it now, so many years later, the common element was common sense. So there was a program of cleaning up contaminated sites in New Jersey, and it was an enforcement program, and we had more sites than most states, many states combined, for all the reasons that we all know. So the normal protocol would be there was an enforcement list, and then the department enforcement team would eventually work their way down the list. They'd get to a property owner and say, okay, it's your turn, you got to clean this up. We're going to start an enforcement action against you and then negotiate a cleanup plan. One day, our commissioner, the then commissioner, new commissioner of all our cleanup issues, calls on the
Assistant Commissioner. Right.
Lance
right.
Miller.
Yeah, right.
Commissioner Lance
Assistant
Miller.
Commissioner. You said Commissioner.
Yeah,
right?
okay, Assistant Commissioner Lance Miller, I'm sorry. And Lance, I remember, calls me up one day and says, look, I got a call from this company, and they have a site they want to clean up because they want to develop it, but they're way down on the enforcement list, and frankly, we won't be able to get to them for at least a year, maybe more. But they're willing to clean it up, and they said they'll clean it up to whatever standards we pick, and they'll pay for it. They just want to develop it. But I told them I'd see if we could move it up a little bit. They probably have to wait at least 6 to 9 months. And I said, are you out of your mind? You mean to tell me that we have a company who's willing to come and meet whatever standards we set, pay for the cleanup and make that land profitable, and we're going to somehow stand in the way of that. That led to the voluntary cleanup program that eventually got adopted and memorialized in regulation. And it's something that we were all very proud of at the time. It was just breaking through common sense.
Excuse me. There was a perception, and perhaps still is, that turning the DEP around, I think in fact you were even the person who talked about turning a battleship around,
right.
and the amount of time that it takes. Did you feel in those couple of years that you were at the DEP
Right.
that battleship did begin to make that turn, and did that turn, in your estimation, continue for any period of time after your departure?
Well, let's see. I do think it began to make the turn, and I have a recollection, and it will be up to others whether my recollection is accurate or not, that we got to a point where there was more debate and even some rancor over policy than there was over process. There used to be a lot of the DEPs, and essentially the DEP isn't funky, they're not responsive, they're not all these things. But you never got to the heart of the policy issue. I seem to recall less complaints about the operation, which provide the opportunity for more debate and dialogue, and sometimes complaints about the decisions we were making.
Mm-hmm. The first 2 years of the Florio administration, you had a Democratic legislature.
Mm-hmm.
You had a budget that was presented by the governor that provided sufficient funding for all of the programs that you wanted at the DEP. After the 1991 midterm election, the Republicans take a veto-proof majority in the legislature, and the very first budget that the governor presents thereafter is defeated by the legislature. The legislature creates its own austerity budget. The governor vetoes it. The legislature overrides the veto. And I do recall going into the summer of 1992 with the expectation of closing state parks and a variety of other activities.
Right.
How did your relationship with the legislature, and you had at that point relations with members of both parties, how were those issues ultimately resolved? Were they resolved to your satisfaction? Do you think that I do recall that the decision to close state parks was referred to as a crying wolf,
right.
that it wasn't truly necessary. How did all that play out? How did all that work out in terms of in your judgment, in terms of both policy
right.
and politics?
The policy worked out that eventually the park stayed open. And that happened because eventually everybody that needed to become convinced that we weren't crying wolf or we weren't manufacturing a crisis began to realize that was true. Now, for anybody watching this contemporaneously, in 2013, the contemporaneous analogy are the air traffic controllers that were the subject of sequester. Mm-hmm. And as I explained to some of my colleagues, I don't know enough about that, but there was the result of the budget cuts because of the restrictions on the use of certain monies meant that if there was no money in the parks budget to keep the parks open, and because everything else was being cut, we really had to close the parks. That those were dedicated funds, and that we weren't crying wolf, we weren't trying to manufacture a crisis. It was one of the most distressing times for me, not just because people thought we were manufacturing a crisis, but because all of us as a department wanted to keep the parks open. This is exactly what we wanted to do. And we were eventually able to work out a compromise, the way we did now, in order to allow that to happen through some statutory authorizations.
Did you find that working with Republicans in the legislature in the second 2 years of the Florio administration was actually easier than doing so in the first 2 years, that once the Republicans had a majority and had some resolution to do something other than say no to the Democratic administration, that you were actually able to get things done with Republican support?
My recollection is that it's very dependent upon the individual. I think that some of the broad trend you described is accurate. That once everybody got over, the initial tussle and adjustment of who was in the majority and who was in the minority, on important issues that people want to work on, you could do it. And I think probably one of our greatest successes was the revision to what was then called the ECRA law, which created the cleanup process that I described before, and replaced it with a new acronym called ISRA. That was a project I worked on personally within State Senator Henry McNamara, one of the most
Republican from Bergen County.
From Bergen County, very conservative. Really not an advocate of environmental stewardship. Not that he didn't care, but he was not an environmentalist, or would be described as that. And he wanted to bring rationality to the ECRA law. He soon realized that the leadership of the DEP and the governor did also. And we worked very hard over an extended period of time and eventually came up with ISRA.
Are there other examples that you can
I'm
recall,
sure there are, but as I just described to you before we started, I'm told my recall is losing. I'm losing my recall, not my memory.
Right? One of the things that that I remember you spent a lot of time emphasizing was, and you've done so as well in this interview, was accountability and transparency. And to that end, I recall you took an area on the first floor of the DEP building that had once been, if I'm not mistaken, a library,
Right.
And turned it into a public hearing room. And in fact, I guess it was shortly after the Republicans had taken control of the legislature, invited the Appropriations Committee, or whichever committee it was that was responsible for the DEP's budget, to come and hold its hearing, not in the legislative chamber, but in the DEP's public meeting room. Some reporters referred to that as a publicity stunt. Others were very impressed that this was an openness and a transparency that hadn't existed before. What was the reaction among legislators? Were they generally positive? Did they view this as a good omen?
I think generally, again, I think it's very personal. I don't know that there was a party position, either party on these issues. And at the department, from the department's perspective, we just wanted to be given a chance to do what we did. And our job was to consider issues, develop policies, and then enforce those policies in a fair and transparent manner. And by creating that room, there was an opportunity to have more public hearings in our facility. Another thing that we did, as you recall, much like the BPU, was that assistant commissioners and myself as commissioner began to chair public hearings, so that not only would we hear firsthand and not just get a brief summary from a hearing officer, but to really indicate to the public who cared enough to come out to the hearing that we cared enough to listen to what they were saying. This isn't rocket science, to use that expression. But I do think it made a difference, and it allowed us to get beyond the rhetoric of distrust and begin to get to issues of policy. And I think that's what allowed Senator McNamara, and myself, and others to work on the ECRA changes.
One of the more contentious issues, and you made reference to it, was the so-called California Car Initiative. This involved New Jersey adopting by reference a stricter fuel standard than would otherwise have applied, using a section of the Clean Air Act that permitted this. This was viewed by some as being a radical approach, and one that went beyond what New Jersey actually had to do in order to meet the Clean Air Act standards. How did that play out? I recall that the legislature became involved. Was it ultimately adopted, or did you have to backtrack and retreat on that?
Well, we had to backtrack. I have to admit, I can't remember how it was eventually resolved. I remember some of the big issues. And the big issue, and again, for the benefit of anybody watching this wasn't only New Jersey acting alone. The Northeast region at that point had some very severe air problems. Some other states like New York and Massachusetts were about to or had adopted the standard. It was, we were talking about building a Northeast market for fuels, and there was also a car issue attached to it because the cars had to be aligned with the fuel. And Governor Florio announced his support for this policy at a regional meeting of governors, as I recall, in the summer of '91. And the first few weeks after he announced it, we got tremendous support, regionally from opinion makers in the newspapers, editorial writers and the like. And then other forces began to muster up. The predictable industry forces, other people were environmentalists and the like, and the car manufacturers, and the fuel manufacturers and others. And there was a tremendous pushback, as you recall. And ultimately, we were not successful in the policy. That, I think, was less significant to me than the rancor with which that debate took place. As I look back, I don't know what I could have done differently. I'm sure the Senate could have done differently to contribute to what might have been a much more effective dialogue, because it had broken down to jingoism, as often happens. But one of my favorite moments was a lobbyist for, I think it was one of the car manufacturers, got up and described how the world would come to an end if New Jersey happened to do what we were proposing to do. And I was able to get up with some good staff work at that same hearing and point out that one of this person's colleagues in the same companies took exactly the opposite position in Sacramento a week earlier. And why does it work there but not work here? So we eventually moved the ball down the field, not nearly as fast as we had wanted to.
Mm-hmm. One of the great tensions that exists at the DEP is between, I'd almost call it a whipsawing, between the regulated community, the industries, businesses, but many of them manufacturing, that are subject to a lot of DEP regulation, and the environmental community, the advocates for strong and strict environmental protection. It is impossible, I would submit, to please both extremes of this continuum. But did you have the feeling when you were DEP commissioner that you were under attack more by any one side than the other? Did you feel as though either side was particularly unfair in the way that it treated the department and the administration?
No, I mean, I really don't recall, but I'm sure that I felt put upon by both sides at different points in time. The one thing I would say, Rick, is that there were some occasions where you just couldn't bring about any reconciliation. Harbor dredging is one I can remember, and in part because one side or the other takes a no-compromise position, and it's very hard then to work towards the middle. But we did find, on most cases where there was a willingness to have a dialogue, that you could advance the ball down the court. But that's what we were there to do. And I think in hindsight, I'd like to think that people would continue to say that during our administration, we did make the process more transparent. In their mind, we may have been doing some crazy policies. Both sides might say that. But I think they understood why we're doing it. They understood the objectives we're trying to achieve, and we were open to other ways to get to those objectives.
In November 1992, Bill Clinton is elected president, and a new administration is beginning in Washington. Right. And my recollection is that for the next several months, you spent a considerable amount of time commuting between New Jersey and Washington, helping to work on the development of national environmental policy. Tell us what that was all about.
Well, the interesting thing is, in terms of national environmental policy, I was doing that prior to Clinton's election as part of a federal-state working group that had been put together specifically on Clean Air Act issues. So this was at the end of the Bush administration.
I should remind everyone that it was President George H.W. Bush who signed the Clean Air Act.
That's right. And
amendments in 1990.
And his administration was very committed to a rational implementation of them, and I had the honor of serving on a number of committees for that. I also had the honor of being appointed to President-elect Clinton's EPA transition team. And that's what took me to Washington. And I got to participate in that process that was, I think, very helpful for New Jersey because it got us to see a lot of issues and create some relationships on the men and women who would eventually become the leaders in those policy areas. It also gave us some insight into the process that was fascinating.
Were you at all tempted to make the jump from New Jersey to federal?
Not at all, not
Okay.
at all. But I do remember, I don't know if you'll be interviewing David Applebaum at all, the governor's executive.
I think it's likely that we will.
But David and I took a trip down right after my appointment. David, for people who may not know him,
He was the policy
director at the time. And we were sitting in the reception area of the transition team. And this was within a couple weeks of the election. And we're sitting there, and we're watching all this activity scurry by, and you get a sense of frenetic activity and a large dose of disorganization. And I turned to David, I said, what does this remind you of? He looked at me, I said, doesn't it remind you of our office 3 years ago? I said, but this is the President of the United States. We were just...
You mean immediately after Governor-elect Florio had been elected? Yeah.
Yeah. So you're watching, you're being part of an opportunity to work on things real time. What I was able to do representing, and doing it, I wasn't representing Scott Weiner, I was representing New Jersey and the governor in both articulating the policy directions that we thought were important for EPA to take in the new administration, and it was specifically an EPA charge. And as I said, begin to establish some relationships that were very helpful in just being able to have dialogues and knowing who to call for what.
Sometime shortly thereafter, this must be the spring of 1993, Jim Florio called you again and asked you to do something else.
That's right. This time I was asked to leave the department and become his chief counsel. And to join the senior staff of the governor's office, and which I did.
And again, did you have the same ambivalence that you had when you had gone from the BPU to the DEP, or
yeah.
Again, this is the governor asked you to do something, you don't say no, or did you relish the opportunity to be in the front office?
Well, I mean, even with the BPU, I mean, there was a little bit of both, and there was a little of both here. I had begun to both turn the battleship of the DEP. I thought we had assembled a great staff. We were really now getting our momentum to do some things, both in the state and nationally, and regionally. I mean, we haven't talked about one of the major initiatives of that time period, which was regional environmental regulation, the Northeast Ozone Transport Commission, the first time states came together in an attempt to regulate air quality across borders. So these were really important issues that I felt very vested in, that on a personal level I enjoyed doing. They were important. But when your governor calls you and says, I'd like you to sit literally in the office next to me and help on the day-to-day operation of state government, at the level of chief counsel, it's also a terrific honor.
Are there particular things that you can point to that you are sorry that you didn't accomplish in the time that you were at the DEP?
Oh, I would have liked to have stayed on with some of the regional air issues. I had served as the chairman for a while of the Northeast Ozone Transport Commission.
Explain what ozone transport means.
Well, this was a federal legislation that recognized under the Clean Air Act that ozone pollutants travel across borders, and what happens in the Midwest is going to affect our air quality in New Jersey. And in fact, because of manufacturing facilities, coal-fired power plants and the like, we could do everything possible in New Jersey and our air quality still wouldn't meet national standards.
On carbon dioxide and oxides of nitrogen,
which are called, generically called ozone. Because of these pollutants floating in the atmosphere from the Midwest here, and this was an attempt by Congress to bring together regulators from the Northeast states to begin to figure out how can we work collectively to wrestle with, and how can we share the burden so that the burden isn't being posed economically on anyone's. So there were lots of things I would have liked to have kept doing. but I got an opportunity to do something different.
Well, just as an aside, just this past weekend, the New York Times ran a major front page story on ozone,
Yep.
on carbon dioxide in particular, having achieved a sort of a threshold level that scientists consider to be almost the point of no return. So we haven't come an awful long way in 25 or 30
No,
years.
we haven't. We haven't. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And for the insiders who are watching this, the RGGI process was the later generational attempt.
It's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which was really the next generation. It's really 2 generations since the Ozone Transport Commission.
So now you're in the governor's office,
Yep.
counsel to the governor, and that primarily, traditionally, is the job of reviewing legislation, making sure that it achieves the purposes that it's supposed to, and counseling the governor primarily on legal issues. Was that the role that you played, or was it somewhat different?
In part, I think every counsel's office is different. That's sort of the standard portfolio. I'm smiling because when I went home to tell my children and my wife that I was asked to take on this assignment, my son was then just a little before his 10th birthday. And he tried to understand what I was doing. And I tried to explain that I was going to no longer be protecting the atmosphere and the birds and the fishes, but I was going to be the governor's lawyer. And he said, well, what does that mean? I said, well, exactly. I review legislation, I give him advice. He said, you mean the governor's going to come in and say, Scott, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? And you're going to give him an answer? And I said, yes. And he said, you get paid for this? Now, the funny thing is, he's now almost 30 and is a very successful lawyer in Manhattan, getting paid very well.
With any interest in becoming an advisor to any governors?
Not yet.
Okay.
He's not at that stage yet. But that was an important part of it. But I also came to the job near the end of the legislative session in an election year. So it brought other characteristics of the job. By definition of both the position and I guess the relationship I had with the governor, I was part of a small group of staff people who would talk regularly with the governor. And in a campaign cycle, people were divided on the staff between those who could liaison with the campaign and those that attended to the day-to-day business of government, and that was really my job.
You were not involved.
I was not
in
involved
dealing
in the
with
campaign.
The campaign
Not at all. My job was to work with the other cabinet officers and just deal with day-to-day issues that come up all the time. So to go back to one of your earlier questions, when somebody might be calling to say, what's our position on this, or what can I do about that, I was often the point of entry for that person.
Mm-hmm. How long were you in that position? This was late 93?
Yeah, I got in
yeah.
in the, as I recall, sometime around May or June. The former counsel who I replaced had taken ill, and that's the reason I was asked to come into the governor's office through the transition, through Inauguration Day in January.
John Schuer says that, whom I interviewed earlier, made reference to the fact that on election night, or the next day, when he walked into his office, he didn't get a chance to ask Jim Florio how he was doing. Jim Florio turned to him and said, how are you doing? Is that your sense as well of how the governor took his loss in the 93 election, that he was even-tempered, more concerned about how the people around him felt than how he himself felt? Did you ever get a sense from him that he was disappointed, despondent, annoyed, upset, any of those adjectives about the results of the election?
He certainly couldn't help but be disappointed, otherwise he wouldn't have been running, but he was never none of the others. Even when the decision was made, when he made the decision in the hotel to call it a night and concede. That was his decision, and he made it, I remember, very calmly. It was clear in his mind what the result was, and it was now time to act on it. That next morning, I think, would be difficult for any losing incumbent governor and the staff, probably more difficult for the staff than for the governor for a whole host of reasons, but we each had our own reaction. He was very much concerned about all of us. That's absolutely accurate.
now Christy Whitman is coming in as governor-elect, and you probably know her certainly a little better than any of the other people who are in the immediate surroundings of the governor. How did this come to bear in terms of working with the transition team for the incoming governor?
Well, for me, both by nature, I think, of my brief history with her, as you mentioned, but also by nature of my position, I got the assignment of leading our transition effort out, which was also, it's a very emotionally challenging thing. So that night, at 9 o'clock at night, you think that your governor is going to be reelected. By 11 o'clock midnight, you realize you've lost. And 8 o'clock the next morning, you're dealing with the loss not privately and not even collectively with your staff, but by having to very publicly begin to plan the transition out with our counterparts. The reason I said the story goes full circle is I called up the person who was going to be her head of the transition and said we'd be working together. And I said,
Was that Hazel Gluck?
No, it was Judy.
Oh, Judy Shaw.
Yeah.
Okay.
I spoke to Judy and said, you know, we went through some details. I said, I want you to know, and I'd ask you to convey to the governor-elect, that I remember and appreciate how gracious she was to me 4 years ago. And I intend to do everything in my power to make sure that this transition is the same.
Okay, let's talk a little about the transition, because you're now basically heading up the transition from the Florio, the departing Florio administration to the incoming Whitman administration. How did that go? You had a relationship with Christy Whitman. You had described it as very cordial. How did the actual transition itself play out?
You know, it played out, I guess, like other transitions play out, which is for the incoming team, it can't happen fast enough. And for some of us on the outgoing side, either it's happening way too fast or it's not happening fast enough. Because there comes a period where one's ability to govern, if you will, to run the department, understandably begins to wane. And people begin to feel very superfluous. And for those who were very into the process of governing, there were others who had initiatives that were still ongoing that they would have liked to have more time to finish. So it's a challenging process. There's a lot of hard work involved for both the incoming administration to get ready and the outgoing administration both to wrap up its business, but to also provide all the support it can to the incoming team.
And at the same time, you've got to be thinking about looking for a job.
Yeah, but I didn't get to do that till afterwards. In fact, there were a couple of us who stayed with the governor for a month or so after the transition. As part of the funding of a transition is also to help the outgoing governor stay organized or get organized.
For how long?
As I remember, it was a couple months.
So you actually were on his staff
as
he's making the transition into
and our job was
becoming
to help
a college professor, I guess.
Wrap up the business of government that we were dealing with, help him organize his materials and attend to all the things that you don't think about attending to.
Now, I know that since you departed state government, you've been working in a lot of different areas having to do with energy, and some of them private profit making, some of them consulting and so forth. But there was one period of time during which you came back into state government. And I'd like you to describe that for us.
I had the honor of being asked by then Governor-elect Corzine to be part of his transition team. And I worked on that team on issues related to what I had done during the Florio administration, the organization of the governor's office, the role of the council, some energy and environmental issues and the like. And one of the issues Governor Corzine was going to be facing as he came in dealt with the school construction program, the building, the state financing and construction of new school facilities in what used to be called Abbott districts, the 31 special needs districts. And it had some particular problems. And as we began to delve into those problems, I was asked to join a group of people on the transition team looking at that. We concluded that this was a management issue as much as anything else. And I guess that the governor and some of the governor's team that knew me from the Florio days thought I would be a good candidate to help during the transition, and I was appointed as a special counsel of the governor and a special assistant attorney general for school construction for the purposes of helping reorganize the school construction corporation while the corporation itself looked for a new CEO. Long story made short, after recruiting most of the senior staff and having taken that role and having the board do a search, I was asked a few months later to stay on full-time as the CEO, and I accepted that opportunity.
You mentioned this as primarily a management function.
Right.
Is that, do you think that your experience in the Florio administration, well, both in and out, that management, that I don't know that I necessarily call it crisis management, but taking an agency and fixing it, do you think that's your specialty? Is that what you would say is your calling?
I think sometimes when people ask me to sum up in a sentence, I talk about leading organizations through transitions. I think the public sector, and particularly senior governmental positions and major agencies, bring special challenges to them. And in fact, when the school construction program started at one point, there was a view to bring in somebody who was very successful in the construction industry. And I'm oversimplifying it. And he was a terrific gentleman and had a terrific career and did some very good things in the program, but was completely unfamiliar with the workings of government, particularly at a senior level in a high-profile agency. So then there was a desire to bring somebody in who knew a little bit about construction, but knew more about running an agency. And he too met with some challenges. And I had the opportunity to do this, and I think that I brought.
So you were the third string.
Well, I was the third string.
But you're the one who lasted, I guess.
Well, they had lasted too, but I like to think I was the one who had some demonstrated successes. While I was there, we were able to have the legislature enact two very important pieces of legislation. One was the restructuring of the agency, and it became the School Development Authority, which was much different than just a change in names. We completely reorganized its structure and its functioning and how it interacted with the school districts and the Department of Education. And even more importantly, the next year the legislature appropriated $4 billion of new money to provide for the construction of schools. And I point to that as the legislature, with the governor's leadership, really endorsing the reforms that we brought to that agency. And during that time period, we opened up 40 schools and developed a process of allocating $4 billion, which is an enormous amount of money, but it was $4 billion against an estimated need that probably approached $20 billion statewide.
Mm. How long did you do this?
I did that for 3 years.
How would you compare the management style of Jim Florio with the management style of John Corzine?
That's hard for me because I had such a different relationship with both of them that even when I was being in the governor's office is much different than being in a department. Being in a department and a cabinet officer is much different than being an independent agency head for any government. So I really can't make a comparison.
Well, but the Board of Public Utilities was quasi-independent.
But I was part of the family there. I mean, I knew Governor Corzine tangentially because we crossed paths in New Jersey, but I really had never worked with him before. And I will say that during the early years, but there were a couple of things. During the transition we talked about, I pointed out that I felt there were a number of ways one could meet the Supreme Court mandate involving school construction, and having a school construction corporation or anything like that was not necessarily the only way to do it. It had certain advantages, but it wasn't the only way to do it. And unless a governor was prepared to really support that mission, allow for its funding, allow for its professionals to be paid an appropriate salary, that we would never be able to succeed and it would always become a failure. The governor was committed to the operational model and also never wavered in his commitment to the agency. So one of the things we did was we reorganized, we restaffed, we were able to pay people competitive salaries, and we were able to essentially manage a multi-billion-dollar construction management company. So he was very supportive that way.
Back to Florio, just for
Sure.
sort of a final set of questions. The same question I've asked just about everybody. There was a calculated decision made early on in the Florio administration to spend the governor's political capital, to do the auto insurance reform, to do the assault rifles ban, to take on the teachers union on the issue of pensions in education financing reform, and most importantly to raise both the income tax and sales tax simultaneously, with the expectation that over the next 3.5 years the governor would have an opportunity to rebuild his capital. As an observer, as a political observer, and one who was actively involved to some extent, if not in that decision-making process, certainly in the ramifications of it. Do you think that had the governor moved more slowly, or had he done things somewhat differently, or if he had communicated more effectively, or if that there were different ways in which he could have approached this, that he could have won re-election? Or do you think that he was destined by virtue of the decisions that he made to have faced those political consequences?
You know, it's such a complex calculus to unwind in hindsight. So you mentioned a number of different things, and could any of those have been done differently? Sure. Would they have changed the outcome? I don't know. It certainly would have changed the middle, would have changed the trajectory of activities. You can always do things better. So with the benefit of hindsight, sure, why spend all the political capital then? How do you then also layer on some of the issues beyond the taxing issues, the right to bear arms issues, the growth of what I'd call partisan media that came in, whether it was then the Trentonian or the radio station, J101.5, all those factor into it. But I don't want to lose, and I'm sure other people have mentioned, the fact that we came within a hair's breadth of winning and re-election, and that as recently as at least the morning of, in all sincerity, we thought we were going to win, and at least up until 2 days before the election, many of our opponents' team thought we were going to win. So it's hard after 25 years to go back and say, gee, if you tweak this and you change that. Those decisions that were made by people who felt that they were doing exactly the right thing to accomplish exactly what New Jersey needed at that time. They're all important policy initiatives, and by definition, it would be very easy for us to sit back now and tweak it.
Well, Scott Weiner, thanks very much.
Rick, thank you very much. This has been great.